Chapter 7, Lecture B. This will be another about a 10-minute lecture over Chapter 7. Yesterday we ended with the compromises of getting the Constitution passed. And we talked about the structure a little bit and how it was a system purposely kind of restricting some elements of democracy and against the rabble. Now, the division and separation of powers, this is a term that will come from Montesquieu, really checking about the branches of government. But one thing that you're going to give is federalism, division and sharing power between the federal, state, and local government. This is a new notion, really never instituted at this level in the history of the world. And so this notion of federalism, which still defines the modern American government to this day, is really one of the most unique elements of the Constitution. Gave each branch responsibilities as well at each level. So think of it as a pyramid. If I was to draw a pyramid, at the top you have the federal government, then you have the state government, you have the local government. At the bottom you have the people that comprise it all. At each level there is powers that are either shared, such as taxation, making laws, or powers specifically defined, such as the government is the supreme law of the land. They deal with foreign policy, military protection, etc. State levels, they deal with, like education now, marriage, and so forth. And at the local level, they deal with local ordinances, like school boards and such. Now, with this checks and balances at the federal level, and this even echoes down through the elements of federalism, you have three branches of government, each with its own branch or each with its own responsibility. So you have the executive, which is headed by the president, which is kind of the default leader of the country. Congress, that makes the laws, carries forth programs, etc., taxation, etc. Judicial, which is the legal aspect or the legal part, and they all three work together to oversee the running of the country. Once again, this is borrowing from Montesquieu's kind of premise from his Enlightenment writings. So this is very revolutionary. If nothing else, this whole part right here is one of the defining moments that countries often want to mimic or are envious of in their governments. Debate over slavery. Now, one of the compromises that was horrifically included in this is dealing of slavery. The words slave or slavery are not in the Constitution. The Constitution does do a lot to protect slavery. However, though slavery is not verbatim mentioned, there is a lot of things referencing it too. So, for example, 3/5 compromise, this agreed that any person who is enslaved, I don't think it says the word enslaved, but is in the work, something along those lines, referring to property, will count for 3/5 of a person. So, what this 3/5 compromise was, the South wanted to include slaves in the total population for the House of Rep, but the North obviously was not ready or eager to incorporate that, because that would have been a heavy population increase for the South. So they came up with a 3/5 compromise where each slave was worth 3/5 of a person. South Carolina delegates came ready to defend slavery as well. They insisted on strict limits on power of Congress to levy taxes within the states and helped devise the Electoral College. South Carolina will be one of the most problematic early states as far as this. They wanted to hold on to their sovereignty and the strictness against the federal government being all the law of the land. They wanted the states to be still powerful, and they also wanted slavery to endure and be well protected. So South Carolina here really goes to battle for slavery and does get some concessions that they will ultimately give into. Slavery was embedded deeply in American lives. This is the new Constitution 4. Slave trade was allowed to go on until 1808, end of 1807, beginning of 1808, when Congress prohibited slave importation. So one consensus to the 3/5 compromise was the slave trade internationally would come to an end in 1808. The fugitive slave clause, slavery to be attached to people even if they escaped to a free state. Thus, if a slave ran away and went to a free state, they were allowed, or the slave owners were allowed to go get them, arrest them, or get them brought back. Of the 16 presidential elections between 1788 and 1848, all but 4 placed a Southern slaveholder in the White House. So slavery thus is very, very important, including our original and first president, George Washington, though he emancipated his slaves upon his death. House of Representatives was heavily Southern influenced due to this 3/5 compromise, and the Southern states will heavily influence the election and the government all the way up, really, to the Civil War. The final document that will be created after this was in the last session of the Constitutional Convention, took place on September 17, 1787. Of the 45 delegates who remained, 39 signed it, with about 6 not signing it or leaving. they sent to the states to ratify it. Now, this ratification process will take a few years to get done. The ratification debate and the origin of the Bill of Rights. So, as we continue on here, looking at this, one of the big obstacles is going to be some people don't think it goes far enough as far as protections, and we'll get to that here in a minute. Now, James Madison and other people who supported the Constitution will be known as Federalists. A Federalist was those who supported the Constitution, and an Anti-Federalist those who opposed it. To get it passed, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it to go into effect. No guarantees it wouldn't. Public battle ensued at each state convention that went to look at the Constitution. Basically a pamphlet will be written called The Federalist, a collection of 85 essays that appeared under the pen name Publius, and they were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, all writing with the reasons why the Constitution needed to be ratified. They assured the protection of liberties in the perfect balance. Now, extend the sphere. Number 10 and 51 of the Federalist. The new government must be based on the will of the people. However, the people had shown themselves susceptible to dangerous enthusiasm, thus why some things were restricted and not fully encompassing. Argued that the United States size was an advantage for a republic because of its ability to grow and populate and just the scope of it. This laid the foundation for westward expansion and the idea that the United States could evolve and continue to evolve over time. Slide number 2 over the Bill of Rights and ratification. Now, the Anti-Federalist opponents of ratification believe shifted balance far too much to central government and too strong a government. But the Anti-Federalists will lack coherent leadership. State politicians' fear of seeing their influence diminish. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry. Ironically enough, Thomas Jefferson was not a huge supporter of the Constitution, but he was not even in the country during its writing. Small farmers did not want a strong central government. The press was overwhelmingly pro-Federalist, though. Madison promised the Bill of Rights to appease some states. Some states, as New York and Virginia, would not ratify it without an additional Bill of Rights with specific rights stated. Only Rhode Island and North Carolina voted against ratification. They had no choice but to join later on due to economic concerns mostly. Now, the Bill of Rights will be added as a piecemeal. James Madison believed the Bill of Rights was redundant or pointless, but he thus still wrote it. He argued that the parchment barriers would prove to be least effective when most needed, example 1950s America. However, like I said, he will write them. It did little inspire in the first 100 years, but would change in the 20th century. The Bill of Rights was added mostly to specifically outline specific elements in the Constitution that are protected. They have notions that were believed to be protected, but they were not spelled out specifically. So if you go through it, you think of the First Amendment, the freedom of press, religion, etc. If you look at the Constitution, the ideas are expressed, but they're never stated as such. Madison also believed that they could use the British common law as a structure, but as a good Americans, we wanted it spelled out specifically. And I'm glad that they did add the Bill of Rights, because you think about the Bill of Rights, right to bear arms, freedom of press, quartering soldiers, search and seizures warrants. If we did not specifically spell those things out, there would still be endless debates about them, even more so than we have today. Okay, so this is going to draw this lesson to a close. Tomorrow I will get in more to We the People and a little bit past the Constitution. But if you look at it, the Constitution as a document itself is very, very impactful. It will finally take effect in 1789. Though it takes 2 years to get it ratified, this document will be, it's still our system of government today, and has influenced other governments around the world. Arguably one of the most important and well-constructed government setups in the history of the world. So I'll conclude this for our lesson today.